Chapter 1. The Portrait at Midnight. The dreams began 3 weeks before the letter arrived. In them, Isolde stood in a library that didn't exist, towering shelves of burgundy leather, candlelight pooling gold across mahogany tables, and a man whose face remained perpetually shrouded in shadow. He never spoke. He only watched her from across the room with eyes that burned like lit coals, and when she reached toward him, her hand passed through cold air and moonlight. She'd wake gasping, her silk nightgown damp, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Isolde had learned not to speak of such things. At 24, orphaned for 5 years, working as a governess for a merchant family in London, she'd cultivated a reputation for steadiness, practicality, and absolute emotional restraint. Dreams belonged to foolish girls who believed in romance novels and folklore. Isolde believed in wages paid on time and a roof that didn't leak. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, sealed in black wax. Miss Isolde Ashford, you are the last known heir to Knightcroft Manor, the ancestral estate of the Ashford lineage. Your great-uncle, the previous lord, passed into eternal rest on the autumn equinox. As executor of his considerable holdings, I must inform you that the estate is now yours, along with all its contents, debts, and historical significance. The manor awaits your presence. Come alone, if possible. Some inheritances require solitude to understand. Mr. Cornelius Thorne, solicitor. Isolde read it 3 times. She had no memory of a great-uncle. Her mother's side of the family was a mystery. Her father had refused to discuss something about old curses and older sins. Now those sins were hers. The merchant's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, had wept at her resignation. But you're like a sister to the children. Isolde had packed her single trunk with the same methodical care she applied to everything. Folded stockings, her 2 good dresses, the leather journal where she recorded her dreams in cipher, unable to stop herself from documenting them, even as she denied their meaning. Knightcroft Manor emerged from the October mist, like something from a Gothic fever dream. The estate sprawled across the Yorkshire moors, all blackened stone and ivy-strangled towers, with windows like hollow eyes and a central keep that jutted toward the bruised sky. Gargoyles perched along the roofline, their mouths open in silent screams. The grounds were magnificent and utterly neglected. Rose gardens gone wild, statuary toppled by time, a fountain that hadn't flowed in decades. Mr. Thorne met her at the iron gates, a thin man with the translucent quality of someone who lived among dusty legal documents. Miss Ashford, you've come. Good. The manor has been restless since the death. Restless? Isolde's voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she descended from the carriage. Old houses develop temperaments, he said vaguely. This one, particularly. Your great-uncle was a private man, scholarly. He left instructions that you should have free access to all rooms save one. He handed her an ornate key of black iron. The East Wing library is locked. The key stays with the executor, unless you request otherwise. I must warn you, Miss Ashford, there are rumors. Local folklore. Nonsense, of course. What sort of nonsense? That your family has practiced. Unusual traditions. That the manor itself is cursed. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. Superstition, naturally, but the staff have resigned en masse. I've arranged for a housekeeper to call twice weekly. Otherwise, I'm afraid you're alone here. Alone. The word settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The first week passed in a blur of exploration and documentation. The manor was magnificent, a labyrinth of corridors lined with ancestral portraits, libraries containing thousands of volumes, salons with furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts. Everything was pristine, despite decades of abandonment, as though invisible hands maintained it. Isolde threw open windows and flung back curtains, letting autumn light pour into the shadowed spaces. She began cataloging the library, the accessible one, on the western wing, discovering first editions of obscure alchemical texts, medieval bestiaries, and volumes bound in leather she preferred not to examine too closely. It was in the portrait gallery that things began to change. The paintings had clearly been maintained with obsessive care. They lined the grand staircase, a genealogy of Ashfords stretching back centuries. The women were pale and luminous, painted in shades of silver and blue. The men were dark-eyed and severe, their expressions carrying centuries of secrets. But one portrait was different. It hung in a place of honor in the entry hall, a massive canvas in a frame of black wood carved with symbols Isolde didn't recognize. The painting was more recent than the others, perhaps 80 years old, and depicted a man in evening dress standing before a backdrop of autumn leaves and moonlight. He had dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes of such piercing intelligence that they seemed to follow her across the room. There was something of her own features in him, the line of the jaw, the high forehead, but his beauty was unsettling. It was the beauty of something dangerous masquerading as civilized. Isolde should have avoided it. Instead, she found herself standing before it most afternoons, notebook in hand, attempting to catalog the manor's art. On the 11th night, she woke to find herself standing in front of the portrait. She had no memory of leaving her bedroom. The manor was dark, save for moonlight streaming through the windows, and her bare feet were cold against the marble floor. But there she stood, in her nightgown, staring at the painted man with an intensity that felt less like her own will and more like magnetism. The portrait's eyes were different. They had been looking right in the previous weeks. Now they looked down at her, following her movements as her breath came in shallow pulls. The shadows in the painting seemed deeper, more textured, as though the canvas had developed three-dimensional depth. "You're not real," she whispered to the empty entry hall. "Your exhaustion, poor food, the isolation of this place affecting your mind." But even as she spoke, she felt it a presence just behind her left shoulder, cold as a winter night, carrying with it the scent of old books and dying roses, and something darker, iron and earth and an indefinable hunger. She didn't turn around. When she finally forced herself back to her room, her heart didn't slow until dawn broke over the moors. The dreams intensified. Now, in the library of her sleeping mind, the man moved closer. She could see the sharp angles of his face, the elegant length of his fingers, the way his eyes held infinite sadness. He would reach for her, and she would stand perfectly still, terrified and longing in equal measure. Once, she felt his fingers brush her collarbone ice against her warm skin, and she'd woken tasting copper, her own blood, as though she'd bitten through her tongue in sleep. By the second week, Isolde had begun investigating in earnest. She pulled volumes from the accessible library, searching for information about her family. What she found disturbed her. References to old rites, to blood-signing ceremonies, to the covenant. Marginal notes in hands she didn't recognize, written in faded ink. He must not break. The bloodline must continue. Only through the union can the curse be lifted. The handwriting changed halfway through the notes, becoming more frantic. "It's too late. He's chosen isolation. God forgive me. He's chosen damnation rather than love." Isolde's hands shook as she replaced the volumes. That night, as midnight approached, she positioned herself in the shadows of the entry hall, wrapped in her mother's old cloak, waiting. Her rational mind insisted she would see nothing, that the portrait would remain exactly as it had been painted 80 years ago. The clock began to chime. On the first toll, the shadows in the portrait deepened. On the second, she could have sworn the man's chest rose with breath. On the third, she heard it the distinct sound of fabric rustling, as though something substantial were moving within the frame. By the 9th chime, the portrait's eyes were open and looking directly at her, and they were no longer painted. They were alive, burning amber in a face of devastating beauty and infinite, aching sorrow. On the 12th chime, Isolde heard a voice, soft as silk, as cold as the grave. "So the bloodline remembers. After all these years, she finally comes." The portrait fractured with the sound of breaking glass, and Isolde screamed herself back into consciousness, unsure which side of waking was real. Chapter 2. The Visions of Blood. Isolde did not leave her room for 2 days. She told herself it was illness, which was partially true. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, her head throbbed with a migraine that no amount of willow bark tea could ease, and her hands developed a tremor that made holding her teacup an exercise in concentration. Primarily, she was terrified. The rational explanation that she had sleepwalked and suffered a vivid nightmare dissolved each time she considered it. She had felt the presence in the entry hall with absolute clarity. The voice had possessed a texture, a depth, a realness that no dream could fabricate. Moreover, when she'd crept downstairs in the gray morning light to examine the portrait, she'd found thin cracks spiderwebbing across the frame, fresh and deliberate, as though it had been damaged from within. By the 3rd day, hunger drove her downstairs. The manor's kitchen was a cavernous space of copper pots and black iron stoves. She prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese, moving mechanically through the familiar motions. As she ate, her gaze caught on a mirror hanging above the scullery sink. Her reflection wavered. Not as her own image, she could still see herself. Pale and dark-eyed, her black hair in a chaotic braid, but there were others behind her. Shadows that had no source, faces that formed and dissolved like smoke. Isolde spun around. The kitchen was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, A single face remained in her reflection that was not her own. It was the man from the portrait, his expression anguished, his lips moving as though speaking words she couldn't hear. She threw the mirror off the wall. It crashed and shattered, and in the reflecting shards she saw multiple versions of him, multiplied by the broken pieces, each one reaching toward her. She ran. The library seemed the safest place, a room of logic and scholarship, of documented facts, and the orderly categorization of knowledge. Isolde spent the afternoon searching for references to her family's history, with the kind of desperate focus that bordered on obsession. What emerged was fragmented and cryptic, scattered across marginal notes and letters pressed between pages. The Knightcroft Covenant, established 1742, requires the union of the bloodline heir with the guardian of the bloodline, the eternal sentinel bound to protect us. Ambrose refuses. He says the price is too high. He says he will not damn an innocent girl to immortal servitude. My brother grows weaker without the bond. The isolation drives him mad. I fear he will not survive another century alone. One volume, bound in burgundy leather and unmarked, fell open as she reached for it. The pages were handwritten, the ink in several different hands. The earliest dated 1763, day 1847, of the Covenant. I have not seen sunlight in 3 years. The mirrors show me things I can no longer deny. My teeth have lengthened. My hunger consumes every waking thought. The servants are no longer safe. I have sent them away. I have bound myself to this library with spells older than Christianity, determined that I will not break covenant or take innocent blood. Isolde was to be my bride, the bloodline convergence meant to heal what is broken in me. But she was a child then, and I could not wait. I could not bear the thought of what I would become in her presence, so I let her go. I chose damnation instead of love. I chose wrong. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries continued, becoming less controlled, the passages more visceral. The hunger is exquisite torment. I taste blood in the rain, in my own breath. The library walls pulse with it, the blood of every Ashford who came before me, written into the mortar, into the air itself. This place is a tomb. I am its eternal occupant, but sometimes I dream of her, of what she might have been. The girl with my eyes, with my bloodline singing in her veins, and in dreams I allow myself to hunger for her, to imagine her throat beneath my teeth, to imagine the sweetness of her surrender. God forgive me, God forgive me. The final entry was recent, dated only days before the great-uncle's death. She is coming, the bloodline calls to itself across time. She is coming, and I am finally, mercifully, at peace. If she will have me, if she can see past what I am to what I might be, then perhaps the covenant can be fulfilled at last. Perhaps I need not wait alone anymore. Perhaps I need not wait for death. Isolde's hands were shaking so violently that she dropped the journal. It fell open to a page near the back, where a single sentence was written in a hand so precise and controlled it seemed carved rather than written. Isolde, my bloodline, my hunger, my eternal beloved, I have been waiting for you across the centuries. Forgive me. Come to the library when you are ready to hear the truth. She looked up. The journal lay open at her feet, and above it, in the darkening afternoon light, the air itself seemed to shimmer. A doorway of shadow opened in the corner of the room, a doorway that had not existed moments before, and through it, she could see a space lined with candle-lit shelves and bound volumes that glowed with their own internal luminescence. And standing in the threshold was him. He looked exactly as he had in the portrait, but three-dimensional now, real in a way that made her breath catch. He wore evening dress of expensive cut, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made her fingers ache with the urge to brush it back. His eyes were amber, burning with centuries of loneliness. "Don't be afraid," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from the portrait, soft, cultured, carrying underneath it a vibration that resonated in her bones. "I know what you are, what you're seeing, what you're feeling." He took a step forward, and the shadows moved with him like a cloak. "I've been calling to you for years, and now you're here, and the manor recognizes you, and the blood remembers, and I." He paused, and she saw the effort it took him to stop. His jaw clenched, his eyes flickered toward her throat, then back to her face with obvious torment. "I have been waiting so long." Isolde should have run. Every instinct screamed it, but her feet remained rooted to the floor, and her voice when it came was steady. "Who are you?" "Ambrose Knightcroft," he said. "Your great-uncle, by bloodline marriage, your ancestral guardian. and the man who has loved you across every life we've lived together, watching and waiting and never quite daring to hope you would come back to me." He raised his hand, not toward her but in offering, leaving the choice to her. Behind him, the candlelit library seemed to pulse with existence, a place that belonged partially to her world and partially to another realm entirely. She could smell it from where she stood. Old paper, leather bindings, and underneath it all, the scent of rose gardens and blood beneath the soil. "Come," Ambrose whispered. "Let me show you what you are. Let me show you what we are meant to be." Isolde took a step forward, and the boundaries between worlds began to blur. Chapter 3. The Ancient Library. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the world transformed. The second library was vast, beyond the possible dimensions of the manor. It extended upward into shadow, and downward into depths that seemed to exceed the earth itself. Candlelight flickered across thousands of volumes, creating an illusion of movement, as though the books were breathing, living things held in careful suspension. The air tasted of copper and turned pages. "This is real," Isolde whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure she was addressing Ambrose or convincing herself. "As real as you are," he replied. He hadn't moved from the threshold, maintaining a deliberate distance that she recognized as restraint, a predator enforcing boundaries. "This library exists in the spaces between moments. It has always been here, beneath the manor, in the margins of what your rational mind can accept. And you're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. Vampire. The word from folklore, from the Penny Dreadful's missus. Pemberton's daughters had sneaked from the lending library. "Ancient," he said simply. "Not as old as some of the texts here. Some of these volumes predate the fall of Rome, but older than I can calculate with accuracy. I stopped counting centuries somewhere around the 15th century. Stopped feeling their weight." He moved further into the library, and she found herself following, drawn along the threads of her curiosity and a deeper compulsion she was beginning to recognize as blood calling to blood. "The Ashford line was not always as it is now," Ambrose continued, running his fingers along the book's spines as he walked. His movements were fluid, controlled, carrying an economy of grace that she suspected masked incredible danger. 500 years ago, your ancestor, a woman named Evangeline, made a choice. She was dying, her bloodline failing, her family's power waning. A being came to her in a dream, offering salvation in exchange for service. She accepted. He stopped before a particular shelf and pulled down a volume bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Isolde's stomach lurched. "Don't fear it," he said softly, noting her reaction. "Fear is your mind protecting itself by rejecting what it cannot accommodate. In time, you'll learn to see beauty in what now seems monstrous." He opened the book, and Isolde saw it was not written in any alphabet she recognized, but as she stared at the symbols, they began to shift, rearranging into English, as though the book itself was translating for her understanding. "The Covenant of the Eternal Blood, inscribed this 12th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1523. Let it be known that Evangeline of Ashford, heir-bearer of the Northern bloodline, does hereby bind herself and all her descendants to the service of the Knightcroft line, in exchange for protection, power, and the gift of immortality through the blood bond. The Ashford heirs agree to marry the Knightcroft guardian, the one bound to our eternal service, thereby creating a union that will heal the rift between mortality and eternity." "I was that guardian," Ambrose said. "Still am, though I haven't fed on the covenant wine in 300 years. The binding made me your family's eternal protector, immortal, and bound to remain in isolation until the bloodline heir came to me willingly. That's—" Isolde struggled for words. "That's enslavement. That's a curse." "Yes," he agreed. "It was. For a very long time, I raged against it. I watched your ancestors live out their lives, marriages, children, deaths, knowing that one day one of their line would come to me, and we would be bound together in eternity. I learned to love and lose. I learned that immortality is another word for loneliness." He turned to face her fully, and she could see the weight of centuries in his eyes. They were beautiful and terrible, burning with an intelligence that no human eye could quite contain. "Then, 143 years ago, I saw her in a dream. A girl child with dark eyes and my own impossible features. I felt the blood recognize itself. I knew that you were the one, and I waited. I was a child," Isolde said quietly. "Yes, and I was strong enough to wait, to watch over you from across the centuries, protecting you, ensuring you reached adulthood safely. I sent dreams to guide you. I woke you from nightmares. I guided your hand when you learned to write, so that your will and intelligence developed in the way I knew they must." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him, winter night, and old roses, and something beneath that made her primitive brain sing with recognition and terror. "I have been patient, but patience ends when the bloodline remembers. You can't keep me here," Isolde said, but her voice lacked conviction. Part of her, a part that grew stronger with each moment in this impossible place, didn't want to leave. "I'm not keeping you." He gestured toward the threshold she'd entered through. It remained open, leading back to the manor library. "You're free to leave, to return to London, to live a normal life." He paused, and the pain that crossed his face was genuine and devastating. "But you'll dream of me. You'll feel this place calling to you. And eventually, when the isolation becomes unbearable, when your blood begins to sing louder than your reason, you'll come back. And if I don't?" Though even as she asked it, she felt the truth of it. The compulsion wasn't entirely his doing. Something in her recognized something in him. Their bloodlines were entangled, written into each other at a level deeper than consciousness. "Then I will wait," he said simply. "I have nothing but time." Isolde moved through the library, running her fingers along the spines of books, feeling the pulse of knowledge and magic radiating from them. She stopped before a particularly ornate volume, bound in midnight blue leather with silver clasps. "What is this?" she asked. "The history of your family," he said. "Everything the Ashfords have been, everything you come from. Read it if you wish." She opened it, and images bloomed in her mind like flowers. Evangeline signing her name in blood, the covenant wine burning her throat as she drank, and felt immortality's first kiss enter her veins. The first Nightcroft guardian Ambrose, young and anguished in his binding, waiting in the dark for his bride while centuries turned around him like seasons. Generations of Ashfords living and dying, the blood diluting, the connection to the covenant weakening, until finally there was only her, the last direct heir, the one meant to restore the bloodline. She closed the book and looked at him. "Show me," she said. "Show me what I am." Ambrose's eyes flickered gold-bright in the candlelight. When he smiled, his canines had lengthened, sharpened, become predatory. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt her own bloodline rise to meet him, a hunger answering hunger, a longing echoing across centuries. "Come," he whispered, extending his hand. This time, she took it. Chapter 4. The taste of the covenant. His hand was cold, but it burned. The moment their skin made contact, Isolde felt it, a shock that reverberated through her nervous system, a sensation like lightning conducted through bone and blood. Ambrose's fingers closed gently around hers, and she felt the barely contained power in that touch, the careful restraint of a being who could crush her without effort, but chose infinite gentleness instead. He led her deeper into the library, away from the candle-lit shelves toward a section she hadn't noticed before. Here, the candlelight was silver instead of gold, and the books on the shelves seemed to hum with a frequency that made her teeth ache. "These are the genealogies," Ambrose explained. "The blood records of every union between guardian and heir. Your mother and my predecessor are here, and here." He withdrew a volume bound in leather the color of dried blood. The cover bore a single name written in script, Isolde and Ambrose. "It's blank," Isolde whispered, seeing the empty pages within. "It's waiting," he corrected. "Every covenant union writes itself into this book. Every blood exchange, every vow, every moment of binding. It will fill itself as we write our story." He set the book down carefully on a reading table of dark wood carved with symbols that made her eyes water if she looked at them too long. A crystal decanter sat beside it, filled with liquid the color of garnets. "The covenant wine," Ambrose said. "The drink by which we become bound. One sip binds you to your family's ancient promise. One sip makes you immortal, but only if you willingly choose me, knowing what I am. The choice must be freely given, or the magic fails. And if I drink, then you become mine, and I become yours. Literally. We will share blood, thoughts, dreams, sensations. I will never hunger for anyone else. The bite that would turn another human to ash will instead complete a circle, make us whole." He studied her face carefully. "You'll live forever, Isolde. You'll watch civilizations rise and fall. You'll lose everyone you know, everyone you might love, unless they choose to follow you into darkness. It's not a gift, it's a burden. But it's also—" He paused, and she saw the centuries of loneliness naked in his eyes. "It's also the end of being alone." Isolde stared at the decanter. her rational mind, the part of her that had survived 5 years of loss by refusing to feel, screamed at her to refuse, to flee, to return to London and her ordinary, finite life. But the part of her that was Ashford blood, the part that had always felt like a key searching for a lock, recognized this as the moment her entire life had been leading toward. "If I don't drink," she asked slowly, "what happens to you?" Ambrose turned away. "I continue as I have, waiting, watching, alone in this library until the centuries wear me down to nothing. How long before that happens? Another 50 years, perhaps. Maybe 100. Solitude is a slow death for creatures like me." He didn't turn back to look at her. "But you don't have to take that burden on yourself, Isolde. I didn't call you here to trap you. I called you here to offer you a choice." But they both knew it wasn't a real choice. The second she'd stepped foot in the manor, the moment her blood had recognized his, the outcome had been inevitable. The Covenant had been waiting 300 years for this moment. Isolde reached for the decanter. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. The wine moved like liquid velvet inside the crystal, catching light and throwing it back in shades of deep red. She brought the rim to her lips. "Wait," Ambrose said sharply, turning back. His eyes were molten amber, and his fangs were fully descended. "You should know. When I taste you, when the bond forms, I will need to feed. 1 sip of wine and 1 sip of blood. It's the only way to complete the covenant. I'll need." He swallowed hard, clearly struggling with the hunger that was radiating from him like heat. "I'll need to feed from your throat." Terror flickered through her, but it was swallowed immediately by a deeper emotion, anticipation. Her body understood something. Her mind was still learning, that his fangs against her throat would be the most intimate thing she'd ever experienced, that his hunger for her was also a kind of love. "I understand," she whispered, and she meant it. She lifted the decanter and drank. The wine burned like liquid rubies sliding down her throat. It wasn't sweet, it was complex, layered with centuries of flavor, tasting of autumn nights and old roses, and the blood of ancient women who had made this same choice. Power bloomed in her chest, spreading through her veins like fire and ice combined. She gasped, and Ambrose was suddenly beside her, his cold hand steadying hers as the decanter slipped from her fingers. "The first taste is always overwhelming," he murmured. "You're changing. Can you feel it? The shift in your blood, the way the walls between you and eternity are thinning." She could. Her senses were expanding, becoming hyperacute. She could hear the heartbeat of mice in the manor's walls. She could smell Ambrose's hunger like a color, taste the centuries on his skin. The candlelight seemed to paint shadows that contained entire worlds. "One more thing," he said, and now his voice was rough with need. "You need to complete the binding. You need to give me permission. You need to tell me it's safe to feed." Isolde tilted her head, exposing her throat. The pulse there was suddenly, erotically visible to her own hyper-aware senses, the life flowing beneath her skin, calling to him. "Feed," she whispered. She heard the rumble that emerged from his chest, something that was almost a growl, but wrapped in tenderness. His arms came around her, holding her close but gently, his forehead pressed against hers for a moment. "I love you," he said. "I will love you for every moment of eternity, Isolde. I promise you that." Then he turned his head, and she felt his lips find the sensitive junction between her neck and shoulder. She felt his breath, cold and living. She felt the scrape of fang against her skin, and then the bite, and the world exploded. It didn't hurt. It was better than pleasure, beyond pleasure, a sensation that transcended the physical. She felt her blood flow into him, and with it, all of her memories, her emotions, her entire self laid bare. And flowing back through the connection came his memories in return, centuries of watching over her ancestors, of loneliness so profound it had burned like acid, of a longing so deep and fundamental that it had shaped the very stones of the manor. She felt his love, not gentle or hesitant, but absolute and consuming, a love that had survived 5 centuries of isolation and wanted nothing but to possess her completely. They were one being, one consciousness, for a moment that seemed to contain infinity. And when Ambrose drew back, his mouth on her skin one final time, sealing the bite with a soft kiss, Isolde knew with absolute certainty that she would never leave this library, that she belonged here in the dark with him, that she had finally come home. She opened her eyes and found them staring back at her, amber and eternal, in the ornate mirror that hung on the library wall. But her reflection had changed. Her skin glowed with an ethereal luminescence, Her eyes held secrets, and where her neck bore the marks of his teeth, silver light traced the bite in the shape of the covenant sigil. "Welcome home," Ambrose whispered against her hair. "Welcome to forever." Chapter 5. The bloodline unravels. The library existed outside of time, but even infinity eventually demands reckoning. It was impossible to track how long Isolde and Ambrose had remained in that candlelit sanctuary. Days? Weeks? The covenant wine had suspended her in a state of euphoria and discovery. She'd walked through centuries of preserved memory, touched her fingers to volumes that contained the lives of her ancestors, felt the bloodline's history pour into her consciousness like water through a broken dam. Ambrose had shown her everything. The journals of her great-grandmother, Evangeline, written in careful script, documenting her first night as an immortal. The hunting journals of her grandfather, Thaddeus, describing his feeding in Victorian London with an aristocrat's detached precision. Her mother's letters to the lover she'd abandoned in the mortal world, written across decades of longing and regret. And through it all, Isolde had felt Ambrose's presence like a second heartbeat in her chest, their blood bond allowing him access to her thoughts as easily as she accessed his. But today, something had shifted. She'd been reading a particularly ancient volume when the wardstone embedded in the library's floor began to glow red. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. The bond was transmitting Ambrose's alarm directly into her nervous system. "Someone is trying to break the manor's seals," he said quietly. His voice had changed in the last hours. It carried an edge now, a warning rasp underneath the cultured tone. Someone who knows the old words, someone with enough power to make the wards scream. They emerged from the library through the shadowed doorway, stepping back into the accessible wing of the manor. The sunlight through the windows sent Isolde's new skin into a scintillation of prismatic light, another change she hadn't fully processed yet, this glittering quality that marked her as no longer quite human. In the entry hall, the portrait of Ambrose was glowing, its protective magic responding to the attack. The front door was scored with symbols of binding and unbinding, written in a substance that smelled unmistakably like blood. "The hunters," Ambrose said. His fangs were descended fully now, his eyes blazing gold, his entire being resonating with a predator's preparation for battle. "Your family made enemies over the centuries, Isolde. There are those who view the covenant as an abomination, who believe our bloodline was cursed rather than blessed." "Who?" Isolde moved to the window, peering out at the moors beyond. In the distance, she could see figures gathering, men and women in robes embroidered with symbols she somehow knew marked them as vampire hunters, descendants of the medieval Inquisition. "The Order of the Devoted," Ambrose replied grimly. "They have hunted our kind for 8 centuries. They believe they do God's work. They've learned that a blood heir has come to the manor, and they mean to stop the covenant from reaching completion." "Completion?" Isolde turned back to him. "The binding is complete. We've already—" "Only the first seal," Ambrose interrupted. "The blood exchange was only the beginning. A true covenant requires 3 nights of union, the taste of blood, the joining of bodies, and the voluntary surrender of mortality's last anchor, the final drinking that makes the change permanent." Isolde's new senses, sharp and terrible in their acuity, caught the sound of chanting from outside. The wards were beginning to crack, fissures of darkness spreading through the protective symbols like veins. "How long?" she asked. "Before they breach the manor?" "Minutes." Ambrose was moving through the house with inhuman grace, methodically checking locks and reinforcing barriers with words and languages that predated English itself. "The library will protect us, but only if we reach it before they enter the house proper. Once hunters cross the threshold of a vampire's sanctuary, the rules of magic change. It becomes a matter of blood and speed and cunning." The front door exploded inward. Hunters poured through like a tide, perhaps 30 of them, carrying weapons that glowed with holy intention, crosses wrought from ancient silver, water blessed by priests, knives wrapped in scripture. At their head was a woman of perhaps 50, her hair silver, her eyes hard as flint. "Ambrose Nightcroft," she called out, her voice ringing through the manor with authority. "I am Sister Margaret of the Order. I am here to dissolve the covenant and claim the blood heir for interrogation. You may surrender peacefully, or you may burn." "I do neither," Ambrose replied. He stepped forward, and as he moved, his form seemed to expand, to darken, shadows gathering around him like smoke. Isolde realized with shock that this was his true form, the predator beneath the cultured gentleman made manifest. He was beautiful and terrible, something that should never exist in mortal space. "The covenant is sealed. The girl is mine." And she is no girl, she is Isolde Ashford, legitimate blood heir to the power of this manor. She chooses to be here. She chooses the covenant, and you have no authority over either of us." Margaret's face twisted with rage. She raised her hand, and the hunters rushed forward in unison, weapons glowing brighter. "Run," Ambrose commanded Isolde. "To the library, now." But something in Isolde rebelled against fleeing. The covenant wine was singing in her blood, and her new instincts, predatory, furious, possessive, surged upward, demanding action. She was no longer human, no longer defenseless. She was Ashford blood, born to this power, and her mate was under attack. The transformation happened without conscious thought. Her fangs descended. Her eyes flooded gold. The power that had been building in her blood since she'd drunk the covenant wine erupted outward like a shockwave, throwing the nearest hunters backward and sending ancient vases crashing from shelves. "Isolde, no," Ambrose began, but she was already moving, faster than thought, reaching the first hunter, and she didn't kill him. Something in her bloodline's nature prevented her from crossing that final boundary, but she fought like something out of a fever dream, using her new strength and speed, disarming hunters and sending them fleeing with cries of terror. When she finally stopped, breathing hard despite having no need to breathe, Margaret was the only hunter remaining. "Abomination," the older woman spat, but there was fear in her eyes now. "Half-born wretch, the covenant has corrupted you." "The covenant has awakened me," Isolde corrected, and her voice when she spoke was layered her own voice and something older, carrying the authority of every Ashford ancestor. "I am exactly what I was meant to be." She moved toward Margaret, and the woman stumbled backward, her hand raised in a warding gesture. For a moment, Isolde considered letting the hunters escape. They were terrified now, broken, no longer a threat. Then Margaret whispered the final curse. "The order will not stop. We'll burn this place to ash. We'll salt the earth. We'll ensure no covenant is ever completed in this bloodline again." Ambrose appeared beside Isolde, and she felt him wrestle with the decision in the space they now shared through their blood bond. "Let her go," Isolde said quietly. "Let them all go. Let them carry word that the covenant stands, that Isolde Ashford has chosen darkness willingly and will defend her choice." For a moment, Ambrose's eyes flickered with pain, the weight of 5 centuries of isolation and loneliness suddenly visible. Then he nodded. The hunters fled into the night, leaving only their discarded weapons and the scent of fear and holy water. But as Isolde watched them disappear into the moors, she realized with sudden clarity that the order would not forget, that there would be consequences, that their choice to bond had set in motion events that neither of them could predict. "We need to complete the covenant," Ambrose whispered. "Tonight, before they return with more numbers, more power, more determination." Isolde turned back to him, seeing in his eyes the mirror of her own hunger, her own need. "Then let's give them nothing to stop," she said, and together, they descended into the library as the manor's wards shimmered and held against the darkness beyond. Chapter 6. The Revelation of Hunger. The library at night held a different quality, less sanctuary, more like the beating heart of some ancient, living creature. Isolde could feel the pulse of it now, the magic that saturated every brick and book, the bloodwork that her Ashford ancestors had woven into its foundation across centuries. It thrummed beneath her new skin like a second heartbeat, synchronizing with both her own pulse and Ambrose's. He had led her to a chamber she hadn't seen before, a room beyond the reading halls, accessible through a door carved with the sigil of eternal binding. Inside, a bed of obsidian stone was draped in silks the color of midnight, and the walls themselves seemed to be made of condensed starlight, glowing with constellations she didn't recognize. "The Chamber of Covenant," Ambrose had explained, his voice rough with hunger and something deeper love, perhaps though it was tangled so thoroughly with desire that she couldn't separate the two. "Where the binding between guardian and heir is meant to occur. Where our bloodlines will finally complete the circle." But first, he'd been teaching her, not with words, but through the bond they shared, through direct transmission of memory and sensation. He'd shown her what she was becoming, not monster or demon, but something else entirely. An Ashford heir, immortal, powerful, capable of speeds and strength that made mortal reality seem fragile as tissue, but also hungry. Hungry for blood, yes, but more importantly, hungry for connection. "The vampiric state is lonely," he'd told her, as they'd sat together on the obsidian bed, their fingers intertwined, their blood bond singing. "That's what most people don't understand. We're not creatures of simple hunger. We're creatures of profound need for connection. The blood hunger is real, but the deeper hunger is for knowing, for being known, for never being alone. And that's why you needed me, Isolde had said softly. That's why I've always needed you, he'd corrected. Across 5 centuries, across the span of your family's existence, I've been calling to you. Every Ashford heir that came before you. I told myself I could live without the covenant, that isolation was preferable to binding myself to a mortal, and every time I made that choice, I died a little more inside. Now, as they faced each other in the glowing chamber, Isolde understood what they were about to do. The second seal of the covenant, the physical joining, was more than a consummation. It was the moment where their bloodlines would intertwine completely, where the distinction between Isolde and Ambrose would become beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. I need to explain, Ambrose said, pulling her close, his hands splaying across her back. What happens when a blood heir joins with a vampire guardian in the covenant space? You'll experience things that will challenge everything you believe about yourself. You'll feel my hunger. You'll want to feed. And he drew back enough to meet her eyes. I will need to bite you again. Multiple times. During the binding, our souls are at their most permeable. Each bite exchanges more than just blood. It exchanges essence, memory. By the time we're finished, you'll have centuries of my life in your body, and I'll have all of yourself in mine. I'm afraid, Isolde admitted. But it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of losing herself entirely, of becoming something so enmeshed with him that she disappeared. You won't lose yourself, Ambrose promised. You'll become more yourself. The part of you that was always Ashford, always bloodline, always mine, that will come into full focus. And his expression shifted into something like reverence. I will finally be able to become more than hunger and isolation. I will become love that has a face, a voice, a heartbeat. He kissed her then, and it was gentle despite the fangs, despite the predatory grace of his body against hers. It was a question. Are you certain? Her answer was to push away from the obsidian bed and remove her dress. Ambrose made a sound that was almost a whimper, a being of 5 centuries making a sound of profound vulnerability because of her. She stood before him, not bothering with modesty. Modesty was a human concept, and she was becoming something else, and let him look at her. Let him see the silver glow that marked the covenant on her skin, the way her blood seemed to light her from within, the way she'd changed and yet remained fundamentally herself. God, Isolde, he breathed. You're beautiful. You were beautiful as mortal. But now, he stood, removing his own clothes with efficient grace, revealing a body that was elegant and deadly, scarred with injuries from centuries of existence, perfect in its predatory configuration. When they came together, it was like collision and harmony simultaneously. His hands were cold on her warm skin, and she gasped at the sensation of his fingers sliding down her ribs, across her hip bones. His mouth found hers again, and she tasted copper and old wine and starlight. She ran her own hands across the scars on his chest and shoulder, feeling the weight of every wound that had nearly destroyed him, every battle he'd fought in isolation. Then he lowered his head to her throat. Tell me to stop if it becomes too much, he murmured against her skin. Tell me, and I will stop. But she didn't want him to stop. As his fangs penetrated her flesh deeper this time, more deliberately, positioning himself to feed while also positioning her for the binding, she felt the universe restructure itself around them. Through the bite, she experienced his memories. She saw the moment of his transformation, not corruption, but an act of love. A woman he'd cared for, dying of plague, choosing eternal life over oblivion. She felt his horror when he'd realized what he'd become. Felt the centuries of that horror slowly transforming into acceptance, then wisdom. She walked beside him through medieval hunting grounds. Felt the ecstasy of the hunt, the terrible beauty of feeding on those who hunted the innocent. She experienced his shame and his refusal to feed on the innocent, the slow starvation he'd endured, rather than take life unnecessarily. She lived through his love for her ancestors, watching the Ashford line develop, waiting for the bloodline to finally produce an heir worthy of breaking his curse, terrified each time that she would come to him and he would fail her, that his hunger would overwhelm his control. And finally, she felt his love for her, not the abstract heir, but Isolde specifically. Every dream he'd sent her, every time he'd guided her hand or protected her from harm, 5 centuries of waiting culminating in the moment she'd stepped into his manor, and his isolation had finally, blessedly, ended. She cried out against his shoulder, and he drew back, sealing the bite with the flat of his tongue, tasting her while also caring for her, the predator and the lover one in the same. "Now," he whispered. "Let me show you what you can do." He guided her to his neck, and she hesitated only for a moment before her hunger, native to her new blood, took over. She sank her fangs into the hollow of his throat and drank. His blood tasted like starlight and roses and 5 centuries of patient longing. It tasted like love. She drank deep, and with each pull of blood came more of his memories, more of his essence, until she could no longer distinguish where he ended, and she began. He held her close, one hand in her hair, the other spanning the width of her back, and whispered to her, "Forever. I promise you, Isolde. Forever. You will never be alone again." And as they moved together, bodies entwined, blood exchanging, souls binding, Isolde knew that whatever came next, whether the order of the devoted returned, whether the covenant demanded more sacrifice, whether eternity itself grew heavy, she would face it with him, bound together through blood and choice, and a love that had already survived centuries. The second seal burned into her skin, as they reached the crescendo of binding, a mark appearing on her heart, visible when she looked down at herself in the starlight. It was beautiful and permanent, and absolutely indelible. There was no going back now. She was no longer Isolde Ashford the mortal. She was Isolde Nightcroft, blood heir and vampire bride, bound for eternity. Chapter 7. The Hunter's Reckoning. The hunters came with fire. 3 nights they spent intertwined in the Covenant chamber, their bloodlines completing the second seal. 3 nights of exploration and binding, of hunger and sustenance, of building something that transcended physical form and entered the realm of pure spiritual connection. On the dawn of the 4th day, the Order attacked with coordinated ferocity. Isolde woke to the smell of smoke and burning sage. The manor's wards were screaming actual sonic wails that vibrated through the walls. Beside her, Ambrose moved with the fluidity of a predator responding to threat, his naked form already transforming as shadow gathered around him like armor. "The North Tower," he said tersely, reaching for his clothes. "They're trying to burn the Eastern archives. They know the Covenant can be broken if enough of the bloodline records are destroyed." Isolde rose, gloriously unconcerned with nudity. Modesty was something she'd shed along with mortality. The new skin that covered her body was luminescent in the darkness, marked with silver traceries where they'd exchanged blood repeatedly. She was transformed utterly, and she could feel the power of that transformation in the way the air bent around her. "Let them burn," she said calmly. "The Covenant's words aren't written in paper. They're written in our blood now." Ambrose paused, meeting her eyes with something like awe. "You really aren't afraid?" "Not of them," Isolde confirmed. "Should I be?" His answering smile was sharp and predatory. No, you shouldn't." They moved through the manor like ghosts, Ambrose leading her through passages she'd never seen, secret ways woven into the very architecture of the house. The fire was spreading quickly. The hunters had used accelerant, had timed their attack for maximum destruction. They'd also positioned themselves strategically, cutting off the main exits. "How many?" Isolde asked as they climbed toward the tower. 40, perhaps, armed with holy water, blessed weapons, sanctified fire. Ambrose's voice was thoughtful, analytical, even as they moved at speeds that made the manor blur around them. "They've learned from their failures, but they've made one critical mistake." "What's that?" "So, they're fighting a vampire who has already lived 5 centuries, and they're fighting a blood heir who has no hesitation." He glanced back at her, and his eyes held something like pride. "We were always meant to be formidable together, Isolde. The Covenant wasn't a curse, it was a design." They burst through the tower entrance, just as the hunters were setting fire to the last of the northern shelves. Sister Margaret stood at their head, her holy symbols glowing with power that would have terrified Isolde 3 days ago. Now, she simply found it quaint. "Fall back," Margaret commanded her troops. "The abominations emerge." Isolde didn't rush them. Instead, she walked forward slowly, her bare feet silent on the stone, her skin glowing with the light of the Covenant marks that now covered her from shoulder to hip. She let them see what she'd become, not quite human, not quite fully vampire, but something balanced between, something that carried the power of both her Ashford blood and her binding to Nightcroft. "You came to break the Covenant," Isolde said conversationally. "You came to dissolve what my bloodline created 500 years ago, but you don't understand what it is you're trying to destroy." She extended her hand, and the fire in the tower bent toward her like a living thing. It didn't harm her, the Covenant fire never could, but it obeyed her will, curling upward and around her fingers like a serpent made of flame. The covenant isn't a corruption of the natural order, she continued. It's the fulfillment of it. My ancestor Evangeline made a choice. She chose survival over death. She chose immortality over oblivion. And every Ashford since has honored that choice, generation after generation, waiting for the moment when the bloodline would finally be strong enough to complete the binding. Ambrose appeared beside her, and together they created a presence that was almost unbearable to stand against 5 centuries of hunger and power, combined with the raw potential of a newly awakened blood heir. You should leave, Margaret said quietly, and there was something like regret in her voice. The Order will pursue this. You know that, don't you? We will never stop. I know, Isolde agreed. And we will never surrender. You and I are at an impasse, Sister Margaret. I could slaughter everyone here. Ambrose could slaughter everyone here. But I'm going to give you the same gift he's been denying himself for 5 centuries. I'm going to let you leave alive. Margaret's eyes widened. Consider it a message, Isolde continued. Tell the Order that the covenant stands. Tell them that the blood heir has chosen. Tell them that if they continue this pursuit, we will hunt them instead of merely defending ourselves. Tell them that immortal wrath is a terrible thing to earn. Why? Margaret asked. Why show us mercy? Because, Ambrose said quietly, speaking for the first time. In 500 years of solitude, I learned that killing creates only emptiness. Mercy creates possibility. Perhaps your Order will reconsider. Perhaps future generations will learn wisdom that your generation has not. The hunters retreated slowly, backing toward the windows they'd used to enter the tower. Sister Margaret remained last, meeting Isolde's eyes with something that might have been respect. You're not the abomination we thought you were, Margaret said finally. No, Isolde agreed. I'm exactly what I chose to be. When the last hunter had fled into the moors, Isolde and Ambrose stood together in the burning tower, watching the flames consume the paper treasures without harming the wood that held them. It was almost like a cleansing ritual. The Order won't stop, Ambrose said quietly. I know. Isolde took his hand. But they'll hesitate now. They'll wonder if they're right. That hesitation is all we need. That hesitation is how we survive. And if it's not enough? Isolde turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression the vulnerability of a being who had expected to be alone forever, and had barely begun to adjust to having a partner in eternity. Then we'll face it together, she said simply. That's what the covenant means, isn't it? We're not alone anymore, neither of us. Ever again. He pulled her close, and she could feel the lingering tremor in his frame, not fear, but the overwhelming relief of finally being able to share a burden that had been his alone for 5 centuries. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I will love you for every moment of eternity. I know, she replied, and smiled against his neck. You've been showing me for hundreds of years. I was just too mortal to understand. The tower burned around them, but the fire couldn't touch them. Nothing could touch them now. They were sealed together by blood and choice and a love that had already survived 5. Chapter 8. The Threshold of Becoming. Winter came to the moors, and with it, the final seal of the covenant drew near. 2 months had passed since the hunter's retreat. 2 months of Isolde learning to exist as something between mortal and vampire. Her body slowly transforming, her new senses becoming more refined and less overwhelming. She'd fed carefully animals mostly, though Ambrose had taught her the old ways of selective feeding, taking only what she needed to sustain herself, refusing to become the thing that humans feared. The manor had become a haven, a refuge. The hunters had not returned, though Ambrose's network of ancient connections brought word that they were organizing, gathering resources, preparing for assault they believed would be more devastating than the first. But Isolde was no longer frightened. She'd learned that fear was a human luxury, and she was becoming something other than human. The Covenant Chamber glowed with anticipation as the 3rd seal approached. The final binding, the voluntary surrender of mortality's last anchor, would transform her completely. There would be no going back. She would walk in daylight only as a shadow. She would need to feed forever. She would watch the world change around her for centuries to come. She'd also decided to complete the transformation during a blood moon, the night when vampire magic was at its peak, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin, when the Covenant itself was most potent. You understand what this means? Ambrose asked her 3 nights before the blood moon, as they lay entwined in their private chambers, a wing of the manor that was strictly theirs. Once you complete the 3rd seal, you become functionally immortal. You cannot be killed by age, and almost nothing can kill you at all. You become one of the few true vampires, not a newborn, but a full heir of power. I understand, Isolde confirmed. I've been understanding it since the moment I tasted your blood the first time. This is what I've always been meant to become. And the world? All the people you've known?" She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of that consideration. To complete the transformation was to fully surrender her human life. There was no possibility of revealing herself to Mrs. Pemberton's children, no chance of walking among humans without constant paranoia, no future in any conventional sense. "They'll age," Isolde said finally. "They'll die. And I'll remain. That's the price of eternity. I've made peace with it. Have you?" Ambrose pulled back to study her face. After 2 months of binding, their blood bond allowed him to sense her emotional state as clearly as his own, but he still took the time to check, to confirm her feelings through direct contact, "Because I need to know that you're choosing this freely, not accepting it because of our bond, not surrendering yourself to me in ways you'll later resent." It was the question of a being who had spent 5 centuries in isolation, terrified of repeating the mistake that had created his loneliness. Isolde loved him for asking it. "I'm choosing it freely," she said firmly. "I'm choosing you freely, and I'm choosing eternity freely. Ambrose, you spent 5 centuries watching my family, waiting for me, and through our bond I've felt every moment of that longing. I've seen into your heart. I know that you would never keep me if I wanted to leave, so I'm asking you to trust me when I say that I've never been more certain of anything in my existence." He kissed her then, and she felt the last of his hesitation dissolve. The blood moon rose like an open wound in the sky. The manor's defenders had been quietly reinforced, a small contingent of ancient vampires who had responded to Ambrose's summons, creatures who had known him for centuries and understood the significance of a proper covenant completion. They maintained the wards while Isolde and Ambrose descended into the deepest part of the library, to a chamber that had been sealed for 500 years. The Chamber of Eternal Binding. It was smaller than Isolde expected, a circular room with a floor of dark marble veined with silver. The ceiling was open to the sky, allowing the blood moon to pour its strange crimson light directly onto them. Symbols were carved into the marble in patterns that made her new eyes water with their complexity. Ancient binding words, the names of every Ashford heir and every Nightcroft guardian. And at the center, a symbol that looked like 2 souls merging into one. "The final seal is different," Ambrose explained, as he led her to the center of the chamber. "The first 2 required our blood exchange, our physical binding. This one requires something else entirely." He produced a chalice of silver, and from a hidden compartment in the wall, he withdrew a blade that hummed with ancient power. "We'll cut ourselves," he said, and Isolde heard the echo of 500 years of anticipation in his voice. "We'll mix our blood in this chalice, and then you'll drink the covenant fully, my blood, my memory, my entire essence crystallized into one final moment of transformation. When you drink, you'll complete the circle. You'll become what you were always meant to be." Isolde took the blade when he offered it, feeling the weight of it, the history of it. This blade had drawn the first Ashford heir's blood 5 centuries ago. It had sealed every covenant since. Now it would seal hers. She made the cut across her wrist without flinching. Pain was different now, almost interesting, a sensation she could observe without distress. Her blood fell into the silver chalice, dark and luminous, already changing color in the blood moon's light. Ambrose took the blade and made his own cut. His blood fell into the chalice and mingled with hers, and where they mixed, steam rose in spirals. The blood became something else entirely, not red, but a color that existed between colors, something that caught the light and threw it back in infinite variations. He handed her the chalice. "Drink," he said simply. Isolde lifted the cup to her lips and drank. The effect was immediate and devastating. Her world exploded into sensation she experienced. Ambrose's memories not as glimpses but as full immersion. She lived through 500 years in seconds. She felt him being turned, transformed, cursed with immortality by the woman he'd loved. She experienced centuries of isolation, hunger, loneliness so profound it would have driven a mortal mad. But underneath all of that, she felt his love for her. Not the abstract heir, but her specifically. Every moment of her life that he'd watched over from across time, every time he'd guided her path without her knowing, every instant of his existence oriented toward the moment when she would finally come to him. And as the transformation completed itself, she felt herself changing on a fundamental level. The last of her human vulnerability was burning away, replaced by strength and will, and the absolute certainty of eternity. When she opened her eyes, the blood moon was inside her. It dwelt in her chest now, a second heartbeat of immortal power. She looked down at her hands and saw them glowing with the full force of the covenant mark silver traceries that now formed a complete map across her entire body, marking every binding, every blood exchange, every seal. She was no longer Isolde Ashford. She was no longer even Isolde Nightcroft. She was Isolde of the Covenant, blood heir eternal, vampire bride of Ambrose Nightcroft, and the hunger that dwelt inside her now was not a curse but a gift, a reminder of the depth and power of what she had become. Ambrose stood before her, and she saw herself reflected in his eyes, beautiful and terrible, and absolutely, completely free. "Welcome," he whispered, "to forever." She pulled him close, and in the blood moon's light, they became shadow and starlight intertwined, eternal and together, alone no longer. Chapter 9. The Covenant Revealed. Transition into Ambrose's point of view for the revelation sequence. He had waited 500 years for this moment, though Ambrose had long ago stopped believing it would ever arrive. From his vantage point in the Chamber of Eternal Binding, watching Isolde's transformation complete itself, Ambrose experienced something he'd thought himself incapable of feeling again. Joy. Not the pale shadow of satisfaction, but genuine, overwhelming joy, the kind that made a creature of 5 centuries want to weep. She was radiant. The Covenant had marked her completely now, and she wore the signs of her transformation like a crown. The silver traceries that covered her skin formed patterns that were unique to blood heir unions, a visual representation of the promise that bound them. Her eyes had shifted to a permanent amber hue, and there was a luminescence to her that would mark her as supernatural to any mortal who glimpsed her, but only if they were perceptive enough to notice the wrongness of her beauty. "What am I thinking right now?" he asked her, testing the depth of their bond. "That you're afraid," Isolde replied immediately. "Not of me, not of what I've become, but of whether this is real, whether after 500 years of loneliness, the universe would really grant you this gift." His breath caught. The blood bond had reached a depth where they could read each other's thoughts with clarity, share consciousness as easily as breathing. He'd known the Covenant promised this. Every volume he'd read, every prophecy he'd studied, spoke of the guardian and heir merging into a true, unified consciousness during the final seal. But knowledge and lived experience were different things. "It's real," Isolde confirmed, taking his face in her hands. "We're real. This is real, Ambrose. 500 years of waiting, and you finally have an end to it." "Not an end," he corrected, gathering her close. "A beginning. Everything before was the prelude. This is the actual story starting." She laughed, and the sound echoed through the chamber, causing the silver symbols on the floor to glow brighter. It was the laugh of a predator who'd finally woken from a long sleep, of a being who understood her own power for the first time. "Tell me something," she said as they ascended from the Covenant chamber back to the manor proper. The blood moon had begun to wane, the first hints of dawn approaching. "Why didn't you ever find another way to break the curse? In 500 years, you must have searched. Surely there were alternatives to waiting for a blood heir who might never come." It was a question he'd asked himself 10,000 times. "There were," Ambrose admitted as they moved through the dark corridors of the manor, "but none that would have given me what I truly wanted. I could have sought out dark sorcerers, made pacts with demons, attempted any number of forbidden rituals, but they all would have resulted in my remaining alone. The Covenant was the only path that promised what I most desperately craved, not just freedom from the isolation, but a companion who understood exactly what I was, who could exist in my darkness without being destroyed by it." Isolde was quiet for a long moment, as they reached the master chambers, the suite they'd begun to claim as truly theirs. Outside, the blood moon continued its descent toward the horizon. "The Order will attack again," she said finally. "Your ancient connections have been sending word. They're gathering something, a ritual of binding or dissolution. They mean to undo what we've completed." "Yes," Ambrose confirmed grimly. "They've been studying the old records, learning the words of unbinding. They believe that if they can sever the Covenant before we've reached what they call the season of consolidation, the first full cycle of moons following the third seal, they can still undo the marriage between bloodlines." "And can they?" Isolde asked, though he could taste the answer in their shared consciousness before he even spoke it. "No," Ambrose said with absolute certainty. "The Covenant is sealed in blood now, written not just into this manor, or even into the books in the library, but into the very fabric of our being. They could burn the entire house to ash, destroy every record, kill every member of either family, and the Covenant would still stand. Because we stand. Because we are the Covenant now." Isolde moved to the window and looked out at the moors as the first gray hints of dawn touched the horizon. She could walk in daylight now. The third seal had granted her that grace, but the sun would always feel like a weight, a pressure that made feeding more necessary, her hunger more acute. Her immortality came with prices as well as gifts. "I want to know everything," she said suddenly. "Every moment of the 500 years. I want your memories of my ancestors. All the visions you had of me before we met. Every inch of the history that created this moment." "We have eternity," Ambrose replied, coming to stand beside her. "We have infinite time to exchange every thought, every memory." "Then we should begin immediately," she said, and turned to face him. In the gray pre-dawn light, she was achingly beautiful, not the delicate beauty of a mortal woman, but the terrible beauty of something immortal, something that had already begun its transformation into a creature of legend. "I want to know the man I've bound myself to across centuries. I want to know every pain, every joy, every moment of longing. I want to become so thoroughly intertwined with you that no power in earth or heaven could separate us." He kissed her as the last of the blood moon's light faded, and felt through their bond the certainty of her conviction. They would weather whatever came, the Order's attacks, the centuries passing, the weight of eternity pressing down on mortal hearts. None of it would matter. They had survived 500 years of separation already. Everything else would be simple by comparison. As the sun rose over the moors of Yorkshire, casting the manor into new light, Ambrose felt the final piece of his curse dissolve. The isolation was gone. The hunger would remain, but it would be a hunger they shared, a hunger that bound them rather than separated them. He was no longer alone, and in the binding of their souls through the covenant, he'd finally discovered what 5 centuries of solitude had been preparing him for. Not damnation, but salvation. Not curse, but grace. "I love you," he whispered against her hair as the morning light grew stronger. "Forever, Isolde. For every moment of this eternity we've chosen together." "I know," she replied. "And I love you. For being patient, for waiting, for refusing to break even in the darkest moments of your isolation, for being exactly the man my bloodline created you to be." Outside, the world continued on, indifferent to the revolution that had just occurred within the manor's walls. Hunters plotted, seasons changed, mortals lived and died and never knew that in the heart of the Yorkshire moors, 2 souls had finally been made whole. Chapter 10. The Hunters' Last Siege. They came on the winter solstice with fire and fury. The Order of the Devoted had apparently decided that patience and mercy were weaknesses to be exploited. Sister Margaret led 3 times the number of hunters they'd faced during the first attack, armed with weapons that glowed with a radiance that even Isolde found mildly uncomfortable. Holy water blessed by a cardinal, knives cast from melted church bells, symbols written in salt that had been sanctified by priests in a monastery that predated the Reformation. It was impressive, in its way, also utterly futile. "They don't understand," Isolde said calmly to Ambrose as they watched the hunters surround the manor from the tower windows. 6 weeks had passed since the completion of the Covenant's 3rd seal, and she'd grown more comfortable with her immortal nature with each passing day. The hunger was manageable now, a constant hum rather than a screaming need. Her senses had refined to the point where she could identify individual hunters by scent. She could predict their movements before they made them. "They're fighting a war they've already lost. Let them understand at their own pace," Ambrose replied, his arm around her shoulders. "Fighting has taught them nothing. Perhaps complete defeat will teach them what words cannot." The assault began with flaming projectiles that arced over the manor's defensive wards. Isolde felt them impact the magical shields, felt the heat and fury of the attack, and felt absolutely no concern. The wards would hold. They'd been reinforced by Ambrose and several ancient vampires who had come to witness the Covenant's completion, creatures that had survived centuries, some of them millennia, and understood the architecture of protective magic at depths that no mortal hunter could comprehend. "Come," Ambrose said, taking her hand. "Let's end this." They moved through the manor like smoke, appearing in the main hall just as the hunters breached the outer doors. Sister Margaret's face showed a flicker of doubt the last time she'd seen Isolde. The new blood air had been raw and untested. Now she faced a creature that had been immortal for over a month, that carried herself with the certainty of someone who had already glimpsed eternity. "Stand down," Sister Margaret commanded, though her voice lacked conviction. "You've been deceived by these creatures, child. The Covenant has corrupted you. We're here to save you from damnation." Isolde stepped forward, and the very air seemed to darken around her. This was what the Covenant had prepared her for, not violence, though she was capable of that, but presence. the sheer force of a being who had accepted her nature completely and moved through the world with the confidence of the inevitable. "You've misunderstood the covenant from the beginning," Isolde said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the hunters flinch. "You believe it to be a corruption of the natural order. You believe my family made a deal with darkness. But you're wrong. The covenant is the fulfillment of natural order. My ancestors chose strength over weakness, eternity over oblivion. They chose this. Your ancestors were deceived," Margaret insisted. But she was backing away slowly. "Then so was I," Isolde replied. "And I accept my deception willingly. I accept the darkness. I accept the hunger. I accept the eternity. Because in doing so, I've discovered something that your centuries of righteousness could never teach. True love, true partnership, true freedom from the tyranny of sequential time." She extended her hand, and every candle in the manor ignited simultaneously. The flames burned with her will, not with heat but with purpose. The hunters fell back, terror overcoming their holy certainty. "Leave," Ambrose commanded, stepping forward to stand beside Isolde. Together they were a force of nature, 500 years of immortal power, combined with the raw potential of a newly awakened blood heir. "Tell the order that the covenant stands. Tell them that we are bound beyond breaking, and tell them that if they pursue this vendetta further, we will stop defending and begin hunting." It was Sister Margaret's decision to flee that preserved the lives of most of the hunters. The older woman recognized an unwinnable battle when she saw one, and she led her people away, back into the winter night from which they'd emerged. In the silence that followed their departure, Isolde felt Ambrose's hand find hers through their bond, not just physically but spiritually, their consciousnesses merging in the way that only the fully bound could achieve. "It's over," he whispered. "The first great test is over, and we've endured." After the hunters retreated, an unexpected peace settled over the manor. Winter deepened, turning the moors into a landscape of frost and bare trees. The hunters' networks, according to word brought by Ambrose's contacts in the supernatural community, had begun to fracture. Sister Margaret had submitted a report to the Order's Council, advocating for a cessation of hostilities. Others disagreed, but momentum had shifted. The notion that the covenant could be broken or reversed had begun to seem increasingly naive. Winter solstice had marked the moment where, according to ancient prophecy, the covenant reached its point of consolidation, the moment where the bond between guardian and heir could no longer be severed through external ritual. Isolde and Ambrose had crossed that threshold, and the universe had acknowledged their permanence. "What happens now?" Isolde asked one night, as they sat together in the ancient library, Ambrose teaching her to read the oldest text volumes written in dead languages that only existed in the blood memory of immortal creatures. "Now?" Ambrose considered the question carefully. "Now we live. We consolidate our power. We study the arts that your ancestors mastered. We prepare for whatever comes next. But also," he looked at her directly, "now we choose what comes next. For 500 years, the covenant was something done to me, something I was bound into through no choice of my own. But with you, everything is different. With you, I'm choosing, and whatever we decide to do in the decades and centuries ahead, we decide together." The possibilities stretched before them like an infinite landscape. They could leave the manor, venture into the wider world, build influence among the supernatural community. They could establish their own coven, create a place of refuge for other vampires who'd fled persecution. They could become hunters themselves, protecting mortals from the true predators of the night, not romanticized bloodsuckers, but the genuine monsters that prowled the dark edges of civilization. Or they could simply exist here, in their manor, building a life that honored both of their natures, creating beauty from darkness, making a home not just for themselves, but for the legacy of every Ashford and Nightcroft that had come before them. "We have time to decide," Isolde said, and smiled at the simple truth of it. "We literally have eternity." "Yes," Ambrose agreed, pulling her close. "We do." Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the Yorkshire moors in white. The manor stood eternal and dark against the winter sky, a beacon for lost souls and a haven for those who'd chosen darkness. And within its walls, two beings sat together, bound by blood and choice, and a love that had survived 500 years of waiting. The curse had ended, and the real story was only beginning. Chapter 11. Dawn Eternal. 3 years had passed since the completion of the third seal. Isolde stood on the manor's highest tower, watching the autumn moors transform into shades of copper and gold. The position reminded her of that first night when she'd arrived at Nightcroft, terrified and exhausted, expecting only to find an empty inheritance. Instead, she'd found eternity, found love, found home. The manor had been transformed under their stewardship. No longer the lonely keep of a solitary vampire, it had become something almost like a sanctuary. Other immortals had begun to come not to join them, but to seek counsel, to learn from the marriage of blood heir and eternal guardian. Ambrose had been teaching, his centuries of knowledge finally finding an audience, and Isolde, drawing on her Ashford heritage, had been learning the arts of bloodworking and covenant magic that previous generations had developed. "Thought I'd find you here," Ambrose said, emerging from the tower stairwell with his characteristic grace. 3 years, and she still caught her breath slightly at the sight of him, the way moonlight caught on his features, the predatory elegance of his movements, the warmth in his eyes that only appeared when he looked at her. "Just thinking," Isolde replied. She was no longer barefaced about her nature, having learned to wear glamours that allowed her to move through the world without immediately revealing what she was. But here, alone with Ambrose on the tower, she wore her true face marked with the covenant traceries, glowing with the light of immortality. About what? He came to stand beside her, taking her hand in his. "About how strange it is to be happy," she admitted. "I spent my entire mortal life preparing myself for loss, for endings, for the fundamental tragedy of human existence. And then I became immortal, and I realized that the real tragedy would have been missing this. Missing you, missing the possibility of eternity. Do you regret your mortality?" he asked, the question carefully neutral, though she could taste his need to know through their bond. "Not even slightly," Isolde confirmed. "I regret the years it took to reach you. I regret the centuries you spent alone. But I don't regret becoming what I am." Ambrose pulled her close, and they stood together at the tower's edge, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. Autumn was his favorite season. He'd confessed to her that every year of his 5 centuries, he'd watched for autumn, drawn to the liminal quality of it, the way it balanced between death and rebirth. This year, for the first time, he had someone to share it with. In the weeks following the failed siege, the Order had continued to attempt contact, but their tone had shifted, no longer demands for capitulation, but tentative offerings of coexistence. Sister Margaret herself had visited the manor in late autumn, requesting a private audience with Isolde. The conversation had been surprising. "I came to understand something in the months after our last encounter," Margaret had said, sitting in the manor's library, while Isolde poured tea, a human gesture she maintained out of courtesy, though neither of them required sustenance. "The covenant between your bloodline and the Nightcroft line. It was never meant to be broken. The prophecies I studied, the ancient texts the Order has guarded, they all pointed to this union as inevitable, necessary, even." "Why?" Isolde had asked, though she'd begun to suspect the answer. "Because the world needs balance," Margaret had replied. "Humanity has always needed the supernatural to exist in shadow, balancing the forces of creation and destruction. The covenant wasn't a corruption, it was a bargain that kept the peace, and in fighting it, the Order had been fighting against the very thing we claim to protect." That admission had led to a shocking proposal. A formal treaty between the Order of the Devoted and the newly united bloodlines of Ashford and Nightcroft. Not friendship, exactly, but a détente, based on mutual acknowledgement of the other's right to exist. It had required 3 months of negotiation, countless meetings, and more patience than Isolde would have expected to possess. But in the spring, the treaty had been signed. Ambrose and Isolde on behalf of the vampire community, and a representative council of the Order on behalf of their organization. There would still be hunters. There would still be conflicts, but there would no longer be open war. "I've been thinking," Ambrose said as they descended from the tower, his hand never leaving Isolde's, "about what comes next. We've consolidated our position here. We've established the beginning of a vampire haven. We've even made peace with the Order, which I didn't think possible 6 months ago." "And?" Isolde prompted, reading anticipation in his emotions through their bond. "And I want to show you the world," he said. "I want to take you to Venice and Paris, and every city that's developed in the centuries since you were born. I want to show you mortal civilization, from a perspective they'll never appreciate. I want to travel with my mate, my eternal bride, and finally, experience the world without the crushing weight of isolation." Isolde's breath caught. "You want to leave the manor?" "Not permanently," he clarified. "But for the next year, perhaps 2. We could establish representatives to maintain the sanctuary here. Your bloodline has enough power now that the manor will continue to function without our direct oversight. And He paused, and she felt the vulnerability beneath his words. I've spent 500 years in this one place. I want to spend the next several years in the world. With you. Making memories that aren't haunted by loneliness. Yes, Isolde said immediately. Yes, absolutely yes. They began preparations almost immediately. The manor staff, a carefully selected group of humans, who understood what the manor truly was, and served willingly agreed to maintain the sanctuary in Ambrose and Isolde's absence. Several younger vampires, eager to learn, volunteered to remain as caretakers, preserving the library and the Covenant space. By late autumn, everything was arranged. Ambrose and Isolde stood once more in the entry hall, looking at the portrait that had started everything, the image that had drawn her across the veil between consciousness and dream, that had called to her across years of separation. I never told you what I thought when I first saw this portrait, Isolde said softly. What? Ambrose asked, coming to stand beside her. I thought it was the most beautiful and terrible thing I'd ever seen, she replied, like looking at the face of eternity itself. And I was right, wasn't I? Looking at your portrait was like looking into forever. And now? He prompted. Now I get to live it, she said, taking his hand. I get to live in forever, with you, building something that goes beyond the Covenant, beyond the bloodlines, beyond even the manor itself. They left Nightcroft Manor at dusk, as all true vampires must. The manor glowed behind them in the darkness, its wards shimmering with the power of 500 years of protection. It would be there when they returned. It would always be their sanctuary and home, waiting. As they stepped into the car that would carry them to London and the waiting world beyond, Isolde felt Ambrose's thoughts blend with hers through their bond. Thank you. For what? For coming. For breaking my isolation. For choosing me across the centuries. For being exactly the bride my bloodline created me to wait for. She squeezed his hand, and replied through the bond. Thank you for waiting. For never giving up. For being patient enough to love me before I even knew how to love myself. The car disappeared into the autumn night, carrying two immortal beings away from their manor, toward the world, toward centuries of discovery yet to come. And in the Yorkshire moors, the manor stood eternal and dark, a beacon of dark grace, waiting for them to return, as they inevitably would, with stories of forever and memories of the world beyond. The Covenant endured. The love endured, and the hunger that had defined Ambrose for 500 years had finally, blessedly, found its purpose, not as curse, but as connection, not as isolation, but as bond. He was no longer alone, and he never would be again. Chapter 12. The Keeper of Eternity. 5 years after leaving the manor, Isolde stood in a Parisian library that would have made her mortal self weep with longing. It was here, among the leather-bound volumes of books that held humanity's collective knowledge, that she truly understood what Ambrose had been trying to teach her since the beginning. That immortality wasn't a curse unless you chose to make it one. That 500 years alone was only tragic if you remained alone. That eternity was only unbearable without someone to share it with. The trip had transformed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Watching civilizations evolve, watching history unfold not as past events but as living experience, had given her a perspective that no mortal mind could achieve. She'd fed carefully from the wicked thieves and murderers who preyed on innocence and discovered that predation could be a form of justice if wielded with intention. She'd walked Paris streets with Ambrose and felt centuries of history hum beneath her feet. She'd learned what it meant to be truly alive when alive was no longer a limitation. Found you, Ambrose said, appearing beside her with his typical grace. He was holding a single rose, not red, but the deepest black, so dark it seemed to absorb light. The rose he brought her every evening of their travels, a gesture that had become a ritual of love and remembrance. Come, I want to show you something. He led her to a building she hadn't noticed before, unremarkable from the outside, tucked between two larger structures, its purpose unmarked. Inside, down a spiral staircase that descended far deeper than the architecture suggested was possible, he revealed a chamber that made her halt in wonder. It was a library of purely immortal construction volumes that glowed with their own luminescence. Books written in languages that mortal eyes could never decipher. Texts that contained the history of every vampire, guardian, and blood heir that had existed since the beginning of the Covenant. There's one in every major city, Ambrose explained, running his fingers along the spines as they walked deeper into the collection. Repositories of knowledge maintained by vampires across centuries. I've been meaning to show you. In 500 years, I never dared enter them. I didn't have the authority, but as blood heir to a major covenant, you have access to all of them. 8. Why are you showing me now? Isolde asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Because I'm going to propose something that will require your knowledge and power, he replied. He pulled down a particular volume and opened it to show her pages filled with a single, repeated word written in Ambrose's handwriting. Isolde, Isolde, Isolde. Hundreds of pages, all of them the same. I've been coming here for 500 years, he said quietly, recording your name, waiting for you, praying to whatever gods might listen that one day you would come to me, and I could stop writing your name into the void and instead write our story into reality. Isolde felt her eyes fill with blood tears, a vampire's version of weeping. What are you proposing? She asked, though her heart already knew. That we establish our own covenant sanctuary, Ambrose said. Not replacing the manor that will always be our first home, our center, but establishing safe houses, libraries, gathering places for vampires who've been persecuted, hunted, isolated, using your authority as blood heir and my influence as eternal guardian to create a network of protection. To finally use the power of the covenant not just for us, but for all immortals who've suffered as I have suffered. Isolde considered the magnitude of what he was proposing. It was enormous. It was also absolutely necessary. Yes, she said simply. Yes. I've been thinking about the same thing since we left the manor. What good is eternity if we don't use it to build something lasting, something that transcends our own joy? The work began immediately. Over the next several years, Ambrose and Isolde began establishing what came to be known among the vampire community as the Sanctuary Network, a series of safe houses, hidden libraries, and covenant-protected spaces in major cities across Europe and beyond. Each sanctuary carried the mark of their union, sealed with blood and covenant magic that guaranteed protection to any immortal who sought refuge within. It was during this work that Isolde began to truly understand what her Ashford bloodline had created. The covenant wasn't just about two beings finding each other across time. It was about the possibility of community, of transformation, of using power not for domination but for protection. More vampires came forward, drawn by word of the Sanctuary Network. Most were old creatures that had survived centuries alone, carrying wounds and traumas that Ambrose recognized immediately because he'd felt them himself. But some were newborn, recently transformed, desperate for guidance. Isolde and Ambrose found themselves becoming teachers, mentors, keepers of wisdom. 10 years after leaving the manor, they returned. The manor was exactly as they'd left it, maintained with obsessive care by the caretakers who'd remained. But it was different now, fuller somehow, imbued with a sense of purpose beyond mere preservation. The library had grown, filled with volumes that vampires across the network had contributed. The Covenant Chamber now hosted ceremonies not just of binding but of healing, of broken creatures finding wholeness through the power of the Covenant itself. We're creating something larger than ourselves, Isolde observed one night, standing again on the tower where she'd so often stood before. Something that will outlast us, that will continue even after we move on to whatever comes next. Not moving on, Ambrose corrected gently. We're building something to last eternity. The Sanctuary Network isn't a temporary thing, Isolde. It's the true fulfillment of the Covenant. My binding wasn't meant to create just us. It was meant to create a new world, where immortals aren't cursed to isolation, but can be part of community. Do you think the Order understands what we're building? Isolde asked. Sister Margaret had become something like an ally over the years. The hunter transformed into a guardian of the boundary between worlds. I think, Ambrose said carefully, that the Order is beginning to understand that the Covenant isn't enemy or blessing, but both. That immortality creates needs and desires that mortality never could, and that the best response to those needs isn't destruction but facilitation, helping immortals exist with honor and intention, rather than trying to force them into extinction. On the 50th anniversary of Isolde's transformation, the manor hosted a gathering unlike any it had witnessed in 5 centuries. Vampires from across the Sanctuary Network came, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, representing centuries of collective immortality and experience. They came to witness and celebrate the union that had made their safety possible. They came to acknowledge that the Covenant, once viewed as a curse, had become a blessing for all those it could reach. Ambrose and Isolde walked through the manor together, greeting each visitor, feeling the weight and responsibility of what they'd created. The library glowed with its own light now, sustained by the blood magic of so many visitors channeling their power through its foundations. Look at what we've built, Isolde whispered as they moved through the gathering. Look at what you've built, Ambrose corrected. Isolde, you came here a frightened mortal 5 years ago. You've transformed into something magnificent not through the covenant, though that helped, but through your own choice, your own will, your own refusal to see immortality as curse. We built it together, she insisted. Yes, Ambrose agreed. Together. But don't minimize your part in this. The covenant could have failed 1,000 times. The hunters could have broken us. The weight of eternity could have crushed us. But you chose to be strong. You chose to love beyond the binding itself. You chose to build. As the night deepened and the gathering continued, Isolde found herself in the library, drawn to the particular shelf where the covenant's story was being written. The book that had awaited her 50 years ago now overflowed with entries, the record of their union, their transformations, their journeys, their triumphs and trials. The final entry was written in Ambrose's careful script, but she could see the place where it transitioned into her own handwriting. The covenant endures. What was cursed has become blessed. What was isolation has become sanctuary. What was hunger for one has become nourishment for many. We are the keepers of this eternity, not its prisoners, but its architects. And we will continue to build, to heal, to create safe spaces for those who must live in darkness. For we have learned that darkness, when shared with love, becomes something luminous. This is our story. This is our purpose. This is our eternity. Isolde picked up the pen and added her own words beneath his. And it's only the beginning. When Ambrose found her there, reading those words, she felt him smile through their bond. Only the beginning, he echoed. I like that. We have forever, Isolde said, turning to face him. Forever to build, forever to create, forever to love. Forever, he agreed, pulling her close. Together, and in the Yorkshire moors, as autumn turned to winter and the blood moon rose over the manor, the covenant blazed with eternity itself, no longer a curse, but a beacon of hope for every creature that had been forced to live in darkness. For they had learned, across 5 centuries and 50 years of union, that the greatest curse was solitude, and the greatest blessing was never being alone again.